Good morning. Can anybody hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, very good. Well, hope y'all had a nice Thanksgiving. And now we got to go hard these last 2 weeks. It kind of snuck up on me. I didn't realize we only had 2 weeks left, this week and next week, and that's it for class. And then the next week after that is final exams. So we're about there. Today's December 1st. It didn't seem, now it really seems like we're getting close now that it's actually December. Well, here's how it's going to go down this next couple of weeks or 3 weeks. I'm going to send this out in a course announcement, so it's written down. But just to wrap things up, now chapter 30, which we completed last week, hopefully you're almost done with that. That's the inflation chapter. And we'll have that due next Tuesday, but don't wait till next Tuesday, okay? Get that done Thursday. But I'm going to give you till next Tuesday because I never really said anything about a due date on that. So, and you know, we've had Thanksgiving, we're all recovering. I don't know about you, but I overdid it. From Tuesday morning to Friday morning, I gained 2.4 pounds. How's that for a glutton for punishment? I think I've got it off. Now, but okay, so chapter 30, and I went in and I programmed. Can you hear that little ping every time someone comes in?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, I got to get rid of that. I was messing around in it, and I think I told it to let me know when people came and left, but I'm sorry I did that. Okay, chapter 30, due a week from today on December 8th, but please don't wait that long because we're going to get going on chapter 33 today. And that will be due a week from Thursday. That's due December 10th. We'll start it today and wrap it up Thursday. And then we've got our last chapter, chapter 34 on monetary and fiscal policy. We'll have that due the following Friday, December 18th. And that'll also be the day the exam is due. Okay, so again, I'll write all this down in the course announcement, so it's before you, but okay. So what we're going to do now is get started on aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Let's see if I can remember how to use this thing. Let's see. Share computer sound. Okay. Hopefully that does it. Can you, where am I? Okay, can you see my screen where it says aggregate demand? We're going demand video. Okay, yeah. Someone say yes. What we're going to do is watch this little presentation, a little lecture on aggregate demand, and then we're going to kind of chunk it up a little bit by watching a video on monetary policy. We'll talk about that in a minute, and then finish up with another lecture, short lecture on aggregate supply. Okay, here we go.
Now we're going to change gears. Thus far, we have talked about long run. Everything's been about the long run. If we take GDP and plot it over time, it looks something like that. Over time, we've got GDP gradually increasing. That's economic growth. But in reality, GDP doesn't flow along like that. That's kind of what we've been doing so far. We've just been talking about how things fit together. We're talking about the banking system, talking about the financial system, we're talking about unemployment and inflation and all that over the long run. But in reality, we've got these fluctuations. Those economic cycles, often called the business cycle, where we've got expansions, we've got a peak, we've got a recession. We've talked about this before when we started in with productivity. And here we've got the trough, another expansion, another peak, another recession or contraction. And we just kind of have these fluctuations around the long-run trend. And as mentioned before, quick review, this is called potential GDP, or long-run sustainable GDP. And these are that's the business cycle. Now in the long haul, 3% growth of real GDP is about normal. That's what's sustainable. Sometimes it gets higher than that. When it's lower than that, when it gets higher than that, we worry about inflation. When it's lower than that, well, we don't like that, especially when it's negative. That's a recession. But now we're going to start looking at these fluctuations. Now, these fluctuations are, economists tend to focus more on the long run. That's the most important thing. Politicians definitely focus more on the short run. They focus on these fluctuations. Oh, yes. Why would they do that? Well, one of the most basic principles of economics is that people are self-interested. They respond to incentives. Okay? Doesn't mean they're selfish. It means they're self-interested. We've talked about that difference before. They act in their own best interest. And what's their own best interest to a politician? Well, to be reelected. So, you've got elections every 4 years. If you're a president, of course, you only have 2 terms available to you. If you're a senator, you've got one every 6 years, and in Congress, House of Representatives every 2 years. So, yeah. These business cycles are very politically charged. What have you done for me lately, world? So, before we can analyze those fluctuations, we're going to develop a new model. Aggregate demand. Well, we're going to talk about aggregate demand here, but there's also aggregate supply, which we'll get to in a minute. But we're going to start off with aggregate demand. So we've got aggregate simply means sum up together. So aggregate demand, when we look at the components of GDP, the components of GDP are consumer spending. That represents consumer demand. Business spending, right? Investment, capital investment, government spending, and exports. We're going to put X minus M. We've been exports minus imports, or net exports. And all that equals GDP. But we're looking at things from the demand side of the economy, so it also equals aggregate demand. I'll just put an AD there for aggregate demand, meaning GDP is composed of C plus I plus G plus net exports. This represents spending in those areas, which represents the demand for goods and services from these purchasers. So, when we talk about aggregate demand, we are summing all these up. We're just putting it all together. We're talking about the whole pie, not just consumer part of the pie, not just investor part of the pie, government part of the pie, the export part of the pie, the whole thing. So when we aggregate, things get a little fuzzy around the edges, and it's not as precise. Macroeconomics is not as precise as microeconomics. But that happens, that's just the way it is when you aggregate. Aggregate, boy, tough word there. Okay, so, well, the good news is that the aggregate demand curve looks just like the single good demand curve. How lucky is that? On this axis, we put the price level. It's not an individual price, it's a price level, say, using an index. Okay, before I was so rudely interrupted, what was I talking about? The price level on this axis here, and we're talking about a price index, overall prices, not like, for an individual good. And then on this axis, we have GDP, or output, or quantity, okay? So it looks the same, but it slopes down, and it slopes down like the individual good demand curve, but for different reasons. And that's what we're going to talk about now, why this thing slopes down. Now, with an individual demand curve, let's say here's price and quantity, Twinkies, okay? When the price of Twinkies goes up, well, let's say there's the price, there's the quantity. If the price of Twinkies goes up, we're talking about relative prices. We're talking about prices relative to other goods or prices relative to Cheetos. Let's say Twinkies goes up in price. Let's say Twinkies goes up in price from, I don't know, let's say $1 up to $2. And then Cheetos, let's say those are the only two junk food items that available. Cheetos goes up from $1 to $1.50. So they both went up, but Twinkies went up by more. So we say Twinkies went up by relative to other goods. So that's why it slopes down. We're talking prices relative to other goods. With the aggregate demand curve, there are no relative price changes because we're talking about the overall price level. We're not talking about one good relative to another. So, why does it slope down? Here we go. The first reason is the wealth effect. The wealth effect says when prices fall, real wealth, okay, your ability to buy goods and services, goes up. And because of that, consumer spending goes up. For example, let's suppose that the price of a burger is $5, and the money supply per person, let's say, is $5. So money supply over price, that is our real money supply. The price of a burger is $5. And the money in your pocket, everybody has $5 in their pocket. We'll just make it real simple, money per person. So money divided by price equals 1. there's your real wealth. In other words, you are able to buy one Big Mac or burger, whatever, Burger King, Whopper. So, what happens if the price falls? Let's say it falls to $2.50. What happens now? What's your real wealth now? Well, now it's 2. You're able to buy 2 Big Macs if the price level falls. So your real wealth, price level falls, your real wealth increases, and because you're richer now in terms of your ability to buy goods and services, consumer spending goes up. You're now able to buy 2 Big Macs. So, you're going to go out and buy more Big Macs than you did before. That's what the wealth effect says. So, putting that into our aggregate demand curve, whoops, there's a price level, here's GDP, there's our aggregate demand curve. What just happened? Here's our one burger, and that's when the prices were $5. Then they dropped to $2.50, and we buy more burgers, okay? That is a very simplifying assumption that burgers are the only good, and the money supply stays constant, and the only thing that changes is price, and there you go. So via the wealth effect, we can see that a downward sloping aggregate demand curve is justified based on the wealth effect. Okay. The second reason is the interest rate effect. Well, going back to our previous example, the real money supply, M over P. The price of a burger is $5. Money supply, well, we've each got $5 in our pocket, so our real wealth is one burger. And as we said before, if the price goes down to $2.50, our real wealth goes up to 2 burgers. However, not everybody wants 2 burgers, okay? They only want 1 burger, perhaps. So just because their ability to buy 2 burgers is there, doesn't mean they're actually going to do it. So what is going to happen is the price, as the price goes down, savings will rise. Okay, that's savings. They're going to still buy 1 burger because that's all they want. And they're going to save the other $2.50. So savings go up, and because there's more money available in the banking system, right? Because savings increases the price of those savings, the interest rate will go down. So banks will now lend out because the supply of savings has increased, so the price of those savings has fallen. Interest rates is the price. They can lend out money at a lower rate because money is lent out at a lower rate now. Capital investment will rise. The lower interest rates make capital investment cheaper, and therefore more projects will be undertaken. That is the interest rate effect. So we've got the same thing. We got exactly the same thing going. We got the price level falling, and we've got GDP rising, but this time via lower interest rates, and this time because capital investment is rising. So again, as you recall, GDP is C plus I plus G plus net exports. The wealth effect talked about how the change in the price level will increase consumption. The interest rate effect talks about how GDP will increase because investment will increase. Okay, so both of those, downward sloping aggregate demand curve works out. And the exchange rate effect. Okay, picking up where we left off with the interest rates, from the interest rate effect, if interest rates are going down, well, let's start at the beginning. Price level falls, savings increases, interest rates fall, and capital investment rises. Okay, focusing in on this part, what's going to happen to the dollar? Well, if interest rates fall, then buyers of bonds will prefer to invest or save their money elsewhere, outside the country, where they can get higher interest rates. So because interest rates have gone down, the savers are not happy, right? Investors are happy. Savers are not happy. So they will do their savings. Whoops, sorry. My goodness. Savings go up. You all caught that, right? These savers are going to buy bonds outside the U.S. because of these lower interest rates. And that will cause, what are they going to do? They're going to have to sell their dollars to buy foreign currency. When you buy foreign currency, okay, to buy a bond outside the U.S., you're going to have to get that currency. If it's a euro, let's say, you're going to buy French bonds, you're going to have to buy euros. So you're going to take your dollars and sell your dollars in exchange and buy euros, but selling the dollar, putting those dollars on the market, will send the price of the dollar down, just like any other commodity. The more you supply to a market, the price falls. So the price of the dollar falls. What will happen to net exports? Well, U.S. produced goods just got cheaper. There are two prices involved whenever someone outside the country wants to buy a good in the U.S. They first have to buy the dollar. And once they have the dollars, then they can buy the goods. So the dollar falling has made our exports, remember this is net exports, is exports minus imports. What we're going to do with a cheaper dollar, foreigners are going to be buying more exports, and because our dollar now is cheaper, we're not going to get as good a deal when we exchange it for foreign currency, so that makes imports more expensive. So we're going to buy fewer foreign imports. So with X rising and M falling, X minus M gets bigger. So net exports increases. So so what we've got so far is through the wealth effect, consumption increases. Through the interest rate effect, This is via a reduction in the price level. Capital investment increases. Okay, government spending is pretty much autonomous. They spend whenever they want and feel like. Okay, they'll raise taxes, or they'll spend taxes, they'll go out and borrow or whatever. So that they do as they please. But net exports, and we'll talk about government spending later, don't worry. Net exports rises. And so what happens? GDP rises. So, going back and summarizing here, here's the price level, GDP. Okay, if the price level, let's say that was 5 and it drops to 250, we would fully expect to see this increase from here to here via the wealth effect through consumption, capital investment through the interest rate effect, and net exports through the exchange rate effect. So that's why the aggregate demand curve slopes down. Again, doesn't slope down like a single good. It slopes down. Single good demand curve slopes down because of it's a relative price change. No relative price changes here, but via those three effects, exchange rate, wealth, and interest rate, we still can draw it downward sloping. And that's the good news. Even though it slopes down for different reasons, it still slopes down, and it looks like the demand curve that we have become very familiar with. So, now that you know why the aggregate demand curve slopes down, now we're going to look at what shifts it. What will shift it to the left? What will shift it to the right? So, the demand curve, this aggregate demand curve shifts just like the single good demand curve. And the aggregate demand curve will shift as a result of anything that shifts C or I or G or net exports. Anything that will shift these items for reasons, it can't be because the change in the price level, because the change in the price level is a movement along the curve. But anything that will change these will shift the curve. So let's look at things that will change. Okay, things that will change consumption. Okay, well, a change in taxes. Okay, a change in stock prices will affect consumption. How does that work? Well, we don't need to draw a curve. How will a change in tax rates affect consumption? Let's say tax rates go down. So before your after-tax income was $100. Well, let's say $1,000. Your after-tax income is $1,000. But now, because of a tax cut, you get to keep $1,100. You're going to spend some of that. So C, consumption, will rise if there's a tax cut. So as a result, aggregate demand will shift to the right. So that's not a price level change. Remember, a price level change will be a movement along the curve. But anything else is going to shift the curve. So a tax cut will shift the curve to the right. A tax increase, well, you're sitting here at $1,000 and now you only get to keep $900 because your taxes went up. Well, that's going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. So consumption will fall. Okay. That's pretty intuitive. How about stock prices? Stock prices go up. Well, when stock prices rise, you know that affects you. You've got all this wealth sitting out there, and even if you don't liquidate any of those stocks, you're very likely to buy more than you did before. Hey, maybe I will buy that new car. Look at all the money I've got there in my stock portfolio. I think we can handle a new car, or maybe we'll just go out to eat more often. Yeah, look at my portfolio. We're doing good. On the other hand, if the stock market falls, you get a little nervous. You tighten up a bit. You cut your spending. Okay, and the aggregate demand curve will shift to the left. Well, what's going to change capital investment? Well, a change in expectations will do it. If it looks like that there's going to be a recession coming up, if they believe business activity is going to, is going to change, if they believe that the new politicians who just got elected are going to raise their taxes, okay, just expectations of the future will cause capital investment to change. If the expectations are negative, if they don't feel very optimistic about the way things are going to be, they'll cut back on capital investment. If things look rosy, if it looks like economic expansion is about to begin, their guy won, their guy is going to lower their taxes, their guy is going to increase investment tax credit, whatever, then this change in expectations will cause capital investment to rise. And so it's the same thing. Aggregate demand via change in investment, rosy expectations will shift it out to the right, pessimistic expectations shift it to the left. Also, interest rates. If interest rates change for reasons other than the interest rate effect, other than price level changes, that will change capital investment as well, and it'll shift. Okay, it won't be due to a price level change. It won't be due to that interest rate effect, but it will shift the curve. It happens through another way. Say the money supply changes. Okay. All right. And government spending, a change in government spending. Well, like we said, it's more or less autonomous. It just they decide to spend, and they do. So let's just say government decides to build more highways, okay, more roads, more bridges, whatever, and that will shift the curve to the right. More government projects along those lines. NASA decides to spend more on rockets to Mars. There you go. More defense spending. Let's say things are heating up in the world and we better beef up our defense. More defense spending. All of those will shift the aggregate demand to the right. Certainly that's what happened during World War II. And going the other way, well, if government decides to cut back, they decide for whatever reason, well, one reason might be that they're so far in debt that it's scary. They might start to cut back on things, and that will shift aggregate demand to the left. And net exports, a change in net exports. Well, an economic boom overseas. Let's say they're booming like crazy. Well, what happens during an economic boom? The people over, let's say in Europe, they're spending like crazy. Everything's good. some of that spending is going to happen over here. I mean, they're going to be buying goods and services produced there, but they're going to buy some of our stuff too. Okay, so that's going to increase net exports, and net exports being a component of aggregate demand, that's going to shift it to the right. A recession overseas, well, they're going to stop spending as much over there, and some of the stuff they were buying, they're going to stop buying here too. That can hurt us. It will shift our aggregate demand curve to the left. If the dollar falls or changes, well, let's just say a change in the dollar. If the dollar becomes cheaper, well, that makes our goods and services cheaper for them to buy, and the aggregate demand curve shifts out to the right. If the dollar becomes more expensive, the dollar rises relative to their currency, that makes our goods and services more expensive. They'll buy less. That aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. Okay, that's a good overview of the aggregate demand curve. Okay, let's review real quick. You know, you're getting, this is rather tedious stuff, I know. Here's the aggregate demand curve. Remember, aggregating C plus I plus G plus NX, the components, the demand components of GDP. Okay, here's GDP on this axis, here's the price level on this axis. We know why the curve slopes down, because of the wealth effect, the interest rate effect, and the exchange rate effect. Okay, so we know why it slopes down. We know why it shifts, because anytime there's a change in consumption, the curve will shift. A change in investment, the curve will shift. A change in government spending, a change in net exports, the curve will shift. Why? Because all these are components of GDP, okay, which means they're components of aggregate demand. Okay, there's aggregate demand. We've got the first piece of our new macroeconomic model in place. Now we're going to deal with aggregate supply. And the bad news is there are two aggregate supply curves. So first is the long run aggregate supply, but we'll do that. We'll cut this one off and we'll do that in another video.
Okay, well, let's go right into that video. And since we're running low on time, I thought we had a little more.
Here we go. One step at a time, don't be living on the line.
Okay. Well,
This video lecture is going to introduce the concept of
not where we wanted to go. Here we go. I set my other computer not to go right into the next video or whatever they have lined up, but I haven't set this one. Everybody still with me?
Yep.
Yay? Okay,
Yes,
thanks.
yes.
Thanks. Okay, we're going to talk about the long run
Okay.
aggregate supply curve first. It's the easy one. Easier. Okay, see the screen? Long run aggregate
Now
supply?
we're going to talk about supply.
Yes?
Yes.
Thanks. Here we go. Long run aggregate supply.
Now we're going to talk about supply. Long run aggregate supply. Well, in the long run, the price level has no impact on supply. So that's what the long run aggregate supply curve looks like. Long run aggregate supply. That's it. Move on. Well, I guess there's a little bit more. Why doesn't the price level affect the long-run aggregate supply curve? Well, because in the long run, supply is determined by the amount of labor, the amount of capital, that's both physical and human capital, natural resources, and technology. That's what determines supply over the long haul. So if the price level changes, well, that's not going to change output. Well, here's why. Going back to our example before, we have the real money supply. Say we had 5 divided by 5 equals 1. When we had burgers, money supply in our pockets of $5 and the price of a burger is 5, our real wealth is 1. Now let's suppose that the money supply is doubled to 10. There it is. Our real wealth is now 2. Now before, in the previous example, the price level fell to 250, and that gave us 2. This time, price level staying the same at 5, and we've increased the money supply. We've doubled the money supply. Now the question is, can you increase real wealth by simply printing more money? In the long run, no, you cannot. Think about it. More money? Are there now suddenly more cows, more chickens? No. No, there's just more money. So what's going to happen? Well, this isn't going to happen here. What's going to happen is this is going to be gradually being bid up over time until prices simply adjust. So in other words, there's going to be some inflation. Over the long haul, that's the adjustment that's going to be made. So again, money supply, price level, that's not going to have an impact, and that's because of something called monetary neutrality. Oh, sorry about that. Monetary neutrality, which we talked about earlier. We talked about monetary neutrality, that what it says that nominal variables cannot affect real variables in the long run. Okay. And as you might recall, real variable is measured in physical units. This would be a real variable, the number of burgers. These are nominal variables, the money supply, prices. This is how many burgers we can buy. And simply by changing this or this isn't going to change this in the long run. So here we are, a perfectly inelastic, if you had micro, okay, insensitive to any changes in the price level. In other words, this is the amount of supply in the long run, right there, that spot, regardless of what the price level is. Well, where this is planted is called the natural rate of output. Okay. Or natural rate of production. That's the output at which we have full employment. So in other words, in our little graph, in this graph, we'd be on this line, okay? This is our potential GDP, and so it's on this line. This is plotting GDP over time, and this here is at a point in time, okay? Where it is, again, this is the natural rate of output, and that takes place at the natural rate of unemployment. So whenever we're producing at the natural rate of output, we're also at the natural rate of unemployment, which is roughly, ballpark 5%-ish. So one of the nice things about this graph, this aggregate supply and aggregate demand graph, is along this axis, as GDP grows, we're moving along this way, but implied there is that unemployment is going down as we're increasing GDP. As GDP is falling, implied is an increase in the unemployment rate. So we don't have unemployment along this directly on this graph, but we know how they're related, and we know what's going on with unemployment as we move back and forth along here. Now this natural rate will change when any of the following determinants of production change. Labor. Well, if we have more labor, say from immigration, that will shift that long-run aggregate supply curve to the right. If we have more capital, that's human and physical capital, more knowledge and skills, more plant and machinery, that will, more knowledge and skills, plant and machinery, that kind of thing. That's plant machinery, physical capital, knowledge and skills, human capital. That will shift this long-run aggregate supply curve to the right. More natural resources, or greater availability. You might have all kinds of natural resources there, but if the law says you can't go after them, you can't, harvest them, well, it's as if they're not there. So greater availability, new discoveries or greater availability will shift that out again to the right. Long-run aggregate supply shifts out to the right, meaning that our natural rate of output is increasing, okay? We're moving along this line. Okay. Well, and technology. That's been a huge one over the years. Technology. We've seen computers revolutionize the economy. We've seen the internet, my goodness, revolutionize the economy. Information technology in general. Shift this thing out big time. Now let's put this all together, what we've got so far. Here's the price level, GDP, long run aggregate supply, aggregate demand. Okay, here's our equilibrium. There's our price level. And we'll just, well, let's just put Q star as our output. There's our level of GDP. Natural rate of GDP, where our unemployment rate is at the natural rate of unemployment. Okay. Now, let's say that there's new technology, some big new machine or a way of doing things, and let's say the stock market is booming. Well, the new technology will shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. And with the stock market booming, remember, that's going to consumers consumer spending is going to increase, and of course consumer spending is a component of GDP, meaning aggregate demand, C plus I plus G plus NX. So we're going to have aggregate demand shifting. We have a new equilibrium. Price level increases, and we have an increase in GDP. This is what we would call inflationary growth. Because note that we have growth, long run aggregate supply is shifted to the right, we have an increase in GDP, but also notice we have an increase in the price level. And that is because aggregate demand shifted out further than aggregate supply. Now let's do another one. Okay, there's our price level, equilibrium price level, equilibrium output. Okay, so, well, let's suppose that greater availability of natural resources and expectations are very optimistic and capital investment increases. So the increase in aggregate capital investment is part of aggregate demand. So we would have a shift in the aggregate demand curve. And in this case, let's say we have a huge increase in long-run aggregate supply. Actually, I should have had this as an example of new technology, but we'll get to that in a second. An example from the 1990s. Well, anyway, this is, we have an expansion here, and there's no inflation. Okay, so that's pretty simple. What do you think we call that? We call that growth without inflation. Okay, growth without inflation. And the key to that is a big shift in aggregate, long-run aggregate supply. So that's how that works. We shift the curves, we see the new equilibrium. That part really isn't new. We've been shifting curves throughout the semester. But now we've got this different model. We've got to remember what shifts long-run aggregate supply. We have to remember what shifts aggregate demand and just take them one at a time. Now, let's talk about this thing that happened in the 1990s. Back in the 1990s, and I'm getting a little ahead maybe with the monetary policy and so forth, but that's okay. Back in the 90s, we had a lot of stuff going on. We had the stock market booming. It was booming like crazy. And we had aggregate demand shifting, big shifts in aggregate demand because of this booming stock market. But also, and right there, Chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank, Alan Greenspan, was under a lot of pressure to tighten up the money supply. Because the worry was, well, what's the worry? If we just stop right here, we go from this point to this point, and we have what? An increase in the price level. We have inflation. So the worry was that because the stock market was booming like crazy, and we were going to have inflation. Because the expectation was that the long-run aggregate supply curve couldn't keep up. So here's our equilibrium there. And we're you know, even if it shifts clear out here, we still got inflation. Now, what was amazing about the 1990s was that the aggregate supply curve shifted way out here. And Alan Greenspan was convinced not to clamp down on the money supply to try to put on the brakes on the economy. Over and over said, come on, Alan, this is the new economy. Don't do it. This is the new economy. That's a term I haven't heard in 20 years because the last time we heard it, I think, was right around 2000, 2002. The new economy meant, back then, technology. Because why did this curve shift so far out? Why did the long-run aggregate supply curve make this huge shift that kept up with the huge aggregate demand because of the booming stock market? We had GDP growing like crazy. As you can see, this models it quite well. No inflation. We had this tremendous economic growth with no inflation. Well, and the reason was we had this amazing new technology called the internet. In 1990, almost no one had internet. Okay, it was just barely even heard of, this I recall. By 2000, everybody had it. Everybody's using it. And of course, by 2010, by 2000, it had revolutionized everything. It had brought the world pretty much close into one market. It had a tremendous impact. The last time we had anything close to this was probably in the 1920s with electricity. In 1920, most homes didn't have it. By 1930, most homes did. And it was, I don't think we've had anything as revolutionary as far as turning an economy on its head, as far as how things were done, and increasing production and productivity as the internet. So that was the belief. That was the new economy. That's what they were talking about. And Alan Greenspan was convinced. He did not intentionally try to slow down the economy. for fear of inflation by restricting the money supply. So it boomed along, boomed along, boomed along. And what part of that fueling the economy was capital investment. Capital investment was another thing fueling aggregate demand. Capital investment was increasing because there was this thing called Y2K. All the computers were programmed without any foresight of changing our century from the 1990s to the 2000s. And they were scared of this glitch that was going to happen and that was going to shut down the system. Well, as soon as we cranked over to 2000, then we called that the Y2K. And fortunately, nothing happened. But all the capital investment, all the preparation for that was fueling aggregate demand as well. And once we crossed over 2000, it's like the brakes stopped. This stopped in its tracks. All that capital investment just came to a screeching halt. And we actually went into a recession because there's this boom, 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 boom. And even though this new technology called the internet had revolutionized the entire world economy, we never heard the words new economy again. I haven't heard it. That was a big word we heard about constantly in the late 90s. Haven't heard about it since. And the reason is, once you've revolutionized the economy, I mean, once it's been done, once we've got these huge shifts in long-run aggregate supply as a result, that only happens once. I mean, it doesn't keep going forever. I mean, once everything's switched over to the internet, then we're back where we were. Now, maybe we can sustain higher growth without inflation than we used to. That's very possible. But the huge gains that we experienced, probably not. You can't count on those continuing on forever. Well, so there's an application of our long-run aggregate supply curve and our aggregate demand curve to a real-life situation in the 1990s. Why was the economy able to grow so fast without inflation? That's modeled perfectly here with these. What happened, the reason it could, is because we had these big shifts in long-run aggregate supply. That's what did it. Otherwise, growth level that fast would have been inflationary during normal times, but it wasn't during the 90s because of this new technology, this new thing, this new internet that we're enjoying right this minute, right? We'd have to shut down. Without the internet, if this COVID-19 thing happened before the internet days, we'd be shut down right now. So it's been a tremendous asset to us. So anyway, long-run aggregate supply in the books. We'll come back with short-run aggregate supply, and that's what we use to model those fluctuations. And I'm sorry to say, it's a little bit involved. It's a tricky one. There's a lot going on there with the short-run aggregate supply. Okay, well, now we're going to change gears. Thus far, okay.
Hi there, welcome back. This is the second video.
Okay, the second video. Every time I stop it, a new one pops up. Here we go. I'd like to maybe skip ahead just a little bit to the next chapter. In talking about monetary policy, we got a great video on monetary policy. Now, once we understand aggregate supply and aggregate demand, we can really understand the next chapter on monetary policy and fiscal policy. Because what monetary policy and fiscal policy are all about is just trying to manage aggregate demand. So we've talked about the things that can shift the aggregate demand curve. That's a change in consumption, a change in investment, change in exports. But also, the Federal Reserve can try to manipulate or stimulate capital investment through lower interest rates or increased money supply. And that's called monetary policy. And the federal government can try to manage aggregate demand through tax rates and spending, government spending. So that's all that is their attempts to manage the aggregate demand curve. So we've talked about the aggregate demand curve already. And so let's go on and talk about at least we can get partway through this video on monetary policy. Now, monetary policy was a disaster when it first started. When the Federal Reserve Bank was first instituted in 1913 in response to the banking panic of the early 1900s, as you recall, that's when J.P. Morgan stepped in and saved the day. It was then determined that an institutionalized J.P. Morgan was necessary, and that's when the Federal Reserve was created. However, their first test came just a few years later in the Great Depression. Federal Reserve Bank, in all fairness, they didn't know what to do. They didn't really understand the power they had over the money supply and the power they had in such a disaster. What the Federal Reserve Bank did, honestly, is they turned an ordinary recession into the worst economic nightmare we'd ever had by doing nothing. Okay, once they accepted that responsibility, it was theirs, and they did nothing. They allowed the money supply to fall by a third, and it was a disaster. So that was the first go around of monetary policy. Well, economists have learned a great deal since then and have had some successes here with monetary policy that we're going to talk about now. You still with me, by the way?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you. Okay, every now and then I want to check in just to make sure. And you can see my screen where it says monetary policy, macroeconomics.
Yes.
You can, okay, and I'm starting the video now and you can see it and hear it.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg Lerner.
In the late 1970s, Chairman Paul Volcker set the Fed on a course that would lead to the worst recession since the Great Depression. What could have been worth such a terrible price? On October 20th, 1987, the heartbeat of the financial world nearly fluttered out. What could new Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan do to revive the patient? By 2008, the American economy was once again in deep trouble. The nation's banking system was near panic. Unemployment mounted, and a great recession was upon us. What could monetary policy do to stem the tide? During the last quarter of the 20th century, the Federal Reserve adopted long-term policy directions from Congress to halt inflation and ease unemployment. A dual and difficult mandate under the best of circumstances. But how well would the Fed do in an economic emergency? Monetary policy, how well does it work? With the help of economic analysts Nariman Behravesh and Richard Gill, that's the question we'll investigate on this 21st century edition of Economics USA. I'm David Shoemaker. By the late 1970s, inflation had taken over again, and there was a widespread feeling that the Fed had to exercise restraint on the economy. But how? Up until this period, most economists felt that the best way to cool inflation was to raise interest rates, keeping the price of money high. That would slow down business investment and spending and put inflation back in the box. But others felt that it was best to work on the money supply directly and to focus on the long run rather than the short run. In August 1979, Paul Volcker became the new Fed chairman. What course would he take? The Fed was already facing enormous criticism, much of it coming from a group of economists called monetarists. At the head of the monetarist attack was economist Milton Friedman.
In my opinion, given that there is a Federal Reserve, the best way for it to operate would be to set targets for a single monetary aggregate and stick to those targets and keep to them as closely as possible. Those targets should be set so as to go from wherever you start to a rate of growth of the money supply which is consistent with zero inflation.
On October 6, 1979, Paul Volcker announced that the Fed would no longer target interest rates, but would focus instead on targeting the money supply itself, restraining it until inflation was broken. In a speech before the National Press Club, he stressed his determination to stick to this long-term course.
Will the Fed stick with it? My short and simple answer to that question is yes. And I don't intend to qualify. I don't intend to qualify that answer. But I do want to be clear. Clear about what the it is that we intend to stick with. It, in the sense of our October 6th actions, is restraint on the money supply, reducing its growth over time toward levels consistent with price stability.
Fred Schultz was vice chairman of the Fed board under Volcker.
But the major change was a difference in how monetary policy was going to be carried out. Before that, there had been an effort to try to have relatively slow interest rate changes. That clearly was not doing the job of controlling the economy in this kind of a very volatile inflationary environment that had appeared in 1979. And so the change was to go to strict targeting on the money supply alone. The effect of that is, if you're not paying any attention to the price of money, which is what interest rates are, the effect of targeting entirely on the supply is that the price of money is going to change a good deal more.
By the end of the year, interest rates began to rise and rise dramatically. By February, the prime rate had reached a record 20%. Among the first to feel the squeeze were small businessmen.
And we understand what the objective of the national government is, what the objective of the Fed is, but we think that what can be a cure for the country's ills can be fatal to the small businessman.
The Carter administration reacted to the sky-high rates by imposing a limit on the amount of credit banks could offer. Suddenly, the buying spree ended, and the Fed was pulled off course. They were forced to expand the money supply to rescue the plummeting economy. But in late 1980, the situation changed. The election of Ronald Reagan gave Volcker the opportunity to return to his long-term plan. As part of his economic program, Reagan encouraged and supported monetary restraint. But in 1981, restraint began to take its toll. High interest rates caused a collapse in the building industry. The high cost of consumer loans put auto dealers out of business and auto workers out of jobs. Still, Volcker held to his long-term course.
Consolidating and extending the heartening progress on inflation will require continuing restraint on monetary growth, and we intend to maintain the necessary degree of restraint.
By 1982, the economy had fallen into the deepest recession since the Great Depression. Even the Reagan administration was urging the Fed to relent. But Volcker and the Fed board, determined to bring inflation down, held tight. Finally, in late 1982, the Fed saw inflation drop substantially and ease the money supply.
Just last week, the Federal Reserve Bank decided to lower its discount rate to 9.5%. The first time this key interest rate has gone below 2 digits since 1979, and the 5th reduction in just 4 months. This demonstrates the Fed's confidence that inflation and market rates will continue coming down, and its confidence that we can work together for a healthy, non-inflationary recovery.
Throughout the recovery that followed, inflation held at 4%. Though inflation had been substantially reduced, the monetarists criticized the Fed for not adhering to a strict growth rate of the money supply.
In my opinion, the actions of the Federal Reserve have added to the uncertainty, have added to the instability of the economy rather than reduced it. And let me emphasize, stable monetary growth is not a guarantee of a stable economy. It's a guarantee that you will not have disturbing elements introduced by the operation of monetary policy. It's a way, as it were, to keep the Federal Reserve from doing mischief, and not a way to produce nirvana.
The idea of monetarism is that there's a stable relationship between money and the gross national product. Well, we've seen that that's not the case. Furthermore, if you were to be very precise in your targeting and just stayed on that target path day to day, interest rates would fluctuate enormously. And that wouldn't be good for the economy. So we took a pretty monetarist approach in October of 1979 because it called for extreme measures. But as you've seen since then, that position has been ameliorated. Now, does that mean that money doesn't count? Of course not. Money is very important. But I think this strict monetarist approach is not workable over a long period of time, but it was necessary when we did it.
Focusing on the money supply appears to have worked, but the cost was high. Chronic inflation, which had plagued the economy for more than a decade, was reduced and contained, but at the price of forcing the economy through 2 deep recessions. Why was the Fed willing to pay such a high price in its battle against inflation? We asked economic analyst Richard Gill.
Basically, they were willing to pay this high price because they saw no alternative. What happened in the late 1970s and early 1980s in the field of monetary policy can be read either A, as a confession of failure, or B, an expression of hope. The failure side was an admission that monetary policy, whether focused on interest rates or the money supply, couldn't do much to avoid short-term difficulties in the economy. And the recession of the early 1980s was serious. People lost jobs, basic industries faltered, and Volcker's policy was often cited as responsible. But the policy was also an expression of hope. It said, in effect, let's shift our attention to the longer run. We may be able to do something to wring inflationary pressures out of the economy over a period of years. In terms of our equation of exchange, it was admitted that in the short run, V and Q might jump around all over the place, but that in the long run, you could control prices, P, by keeping at least a somewhat firmer hand on the money supply throttle. Failure and hope. The latter justified by what did in fact happen to the rate of inflation. It did fall, and in many ways more sharply than anyone might have predicted.
So then has hope won out? Perhaps. Though we discovered in the 1980s that there are times when the short run has to take precedence over the long run. October 1987 gave us a dramatic case in point.
1929. The plunging stock market causes a panic. The Federal Reserve clamps down on the money supply, stifling the economy. Banks starve for ready cash, liquidity, fail by the thousands. Businesses close. Soon, 18 million Americans are unemployed, hopeless, and hungry. This is Wall Street today, buying and selling by computer, trusting Congress and the Federal Reserve to prevent a repetition of 1929. After many years of experimentation, Wall Street and the nation have learned that a long-term, consistent monetary policy is good medicine to keep an economy healthy. But in 1987, the question remained unanswered. What could monetary policy do in an economic emergency?
I have a statement for you. Paul Volcker has advised me of his decision not to accept a third term as a member and chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. I accepted Mr. Volcker's decision with great reluctance and regret. It's my intention to nominate Dr. Alan Greenspan to a 4-year term as chairman of the Federal Reserve.
On his first day in office, Chairman Greenspan revealed his wish list.
A dollar which is always stable, interest rates which stay low, and employment which stays high.
His first action as chairman of the Board of Governors was to reaffirm Volcker's tight money policy, a long-range strategy that most economists believed was crucial to maintaining orderly economic growth. But if there was one sector of the economy that was far from orderly in 1987, it was the stock market.
Angel 784.
Greenspan feared a collapse. But what could the Fed do? Securities analyst Roger Kubarich.
When Chairman Greenspan came in office in August, one of the first things he did was to launch a series of studies, call them war games if you like, that did include both the board staff in Washington, members of the board, and the New York Fed on a number of possible scenarios for market disruption, financial market disruption.
On October 19th, 1987, Greenspan got an unwelcome opportunity to test his plans. The market fell 508 points, more than 5 times greater than the 1929 drop which precipitated the Great Depression. Many investors faced total financial ruin.
There was a clear picture of an impending problem of monumental proportions. So it was a fascination. It was like watching a car accident that was happening right on your block.
The business of buying and selling stocks is based on confidence. By Tuesday morning, October 20th, confidence had fled. What were people afraid of? We asked economic forecaster Neriman Baravesh.
The specter of a 1929-style depression loomed very large for the markets and for the Federal Reserve. The kind of scenario the Fed was most worried about was that people had borrowed a lot to finance purchasing stock as the stock market rose. As it crashed, a lot of those loans were called in, and the Fed was worried that there'd be a lot of bankruptcies, personal bankruptcies, corporate bankruptcies. As those occurred, a lot of people would be laid off, the unemployment rate would rise, and you'd have a full-scale recession and maybe even a depression on your hands.
A bank run seemed imminent. Banks needed liquidity immediately. How would the nation's central banker respond?
Okay, let's call it right there. We'll pick it up where we left off. Next time, we'll talk about the short-run aggregate supply curve, and we'll wrap up this chapter. And I'll write all the announcements I gave at the very beginning. Also, I'll post this. I recorded it, and we'll post this, and we'll see you on Thursday. Have a good one.
Have a good day. Have a good day.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.